I'm going to bring on our first esteemed guest. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who for 15 years was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, serving as the Middle East as well as the Balkan bureau chief. He previously worked overseas for the Dallas Morning News, the Christian Science Monitor, and NPR. Hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm good, Katie.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
You have a great recent piece that caused a little bit of a fight among my friends and families. My family, my mom decided to text. She didn't do an email. She did like a mass text, a group text, and texted out your article. And so there were strong opinions, and we had to actually kill the chat because it was a little too hostile. But that's always a sign of a great writer. Great ideas, very provocative ideas. But you have a very sensible, I would say, piece. That sadly you can't find this perspective most places. It's at ScheerPost, which is the website run by the great Bob Scheer, and it's called Chronicle of a War Foretold. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a near universal understanding among political leaders that NATO expansion would be a foolish provocation against Russia. How naive we were to think that the military-industrial complex would allow such sanity to prevail. You write, I was in Eastern Europe in 1989 reporting on the revolutions that overthrew the ossified communist dictatorships that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was a time of hope. NATO, with the breakup of the Soviet Empire, became obsolete. President Mikhail Gorbachev reached out to Washington and Europe to build a new security pact that would include Russia. Secretary of State James Baker in the Reagan administration, along with the German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, assured the Soviet leader that if Germany was unified, NATO would not be extended beyond the new borders. The commitment not to expand NATO, also made by Great Britain and France, appeared to herald a new global order. We saw the peace dividend dangled before us, the promise that the massive expenditures on weapons that characterized the Cold War would be converted into expenditures on social programs and infrastructures that had long been neglected to feed the insatiable appetite of the military. So my first question for you is, what happened?
The arms industry saw a multi-billion-dollar bonanza, which was converting the militaries in the former communist bloc to be NATO compatible. And that's what happened. Now, every politician and statesperson that I spoke with, I mean, I can't think of anyone who advocated the expansion of NATO. I mean, the tragedy was that Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and we forget in the early years of Putin, there was an attempt, a very serious attempt on the part of Russia to build a joint security pact. We can't forget the trauma that Russia endured in the Second World War when the Nazis invaded all the way to Moscow and devastated whole swaths of the Soviet Union. Of course, that was repeated a century earlier by Napoleon. They have legitimate fears of being encircled. And this was the Tehran conference, the primary issue between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill was carving up Eastern Europe in a way to protect the Soviet Union, to make it feel secure. And both the Americans and the British realized that as a necessity. This was also true in 1989. But unfortunately, that was completely abandoned and there were a series of agreements. So you had the agreement not to expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. Then the Clinton administration, and of course it did. There's now a missile base in Poland, 100 miles from the Russian border. Clinton then promised that he would not station NATO troops in Eastern Europe. We now have thousands of NATO troops in Eastern Europe. There was of course, the Minsk agreement that nobody ever honored. There was a promise not to intervene in the internal affairs of border countries like the Ukraine. It wasn't honored. So what has happened, of course, is preemptive war, which is under post-Nuremberg law as a criminal war of aggression. There's no way around it. And Russia is guilty, but they were baited and they took the bait and they pulled the trigger. And that's kind of the tragedy of what's happened.
So were you surprised?
So a lot of people were predicting that he wouldn't go beyond the separatist regions. I think he overreached. I think he should have stayed in the separatist regions. But I wasn't surprised for this reason. I spent 20 years covering
Right.
war, and I'm well aware of information or disinformation as being a fundamental component to war. So, for instance, in the first Gulf War, when I was with the Marine Corps on the border with Kuwait, there was a huge propaganda, a black kind of information campaign to make the Iraqis think that it would be a seaborne, a coastal invasion, and it worked. They played around with days, so the Iraqis were thrown off balance as to when it would happen. This is always true in war. And after the Nazis took Alsace-Lorraine, they mounted these speakers and had a huge peace offensive. And so I didn't believe anything coming out of the Kremlin. Am I surprised that he did it? I'm surprised that he did it because I think it's really counterproductive. So on that, from a kind of strategic or tactical sense, yes. But I wasn't surprised that he was lying, because that's what every country on the inception of a war does.
You quote in your article, you quote a diplomatic cable. Yeah, a cable that was obtained and released by WikiLeaks.
Right.
And it was dated February 1st, 2008, written from Moscow and addressed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff for NATO, European Union Cooperative National Security Council, Russia, Moscow Political Collective, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of State. And you say that there was this understanding that expanding NATO risks an eventual conflict with Russia, especially over Ukraine.
Well, that's all in that cable. I mean,
Right.
that was the general understanding. So I
Yeah.
could have quoted George Kennan or all sorts of
Sure.
other people, but the cable is kind of interesting because they actually talk about how divisive NATO membership it would be to the Ukraine, what it would do to domestic politics, that it would create an opening for Russian intervention. This is 2008, and that the Russian establishment would be encouraged to meddle in internal affairs in the Ukraine, and the U.S. would then meddle with opposing forces, and this would put, in their words, U.S. and Russia in a classic confrontational posture, and that's exactly where we are.
Right. It says in the memo, right? Not only does Russia perceive encirclement by NATO and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences, which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. And then you describe how it was for these reasons, right? Among these reasons that Obama blocked arms sales to Ukraine.
Yeah,
which was
which was prudent and smart,
right? And then, of course, reversed by Trump, and then by Biden, because you had in this kind of unbelievable, but surely by now, I guess, believable and predictable move. But you saw these, Democrats up in arms and accusing, Trump of being a traitor, because they wanted him to reverse Obama's position, which he ultimately did, and then so did Biden. I mean, why do you think Obama took that prudent decision?
Because he understood that it was dumping gasoline on the conflict.
Right, but why do you think?
Because Biden failed at everything else. I mean, his presidency is a disaster. His opinion poll ratings are in the tank. His Build Back Better bill is gutted. All of his promises, like forgiving student loans and raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, have been forgotten. The moratorium on foreclosures, the extended child tax credit, all the assistance that people got is now being terminated. So what's better than a war? Now we got the EU just announced that they're going to allocate hundreds of millions of euros to buy weapons. Germany just said it would triple its defense budget. Biden has asked Congress for $6.4 billion for the Ukraine. And this is on top of the $650 million in military aid that they've given the Ukraine. It's absolute insanity, especially because Russia is a nuclear power, as Putin reminded everyone. These kind of merchants of death who are making tons of money off of this and made tons of money off of expanding NATO are at this point, I mean, over dramatic, but they're flirting with a nuclear holocaust. It's just nuts.